All right. We're getting started with a talk here in the middle of the space that will be all about system change in fashion, in textile. From the perspective of wool, I'm Haiko Hogervorst. I work here at New Order Fashion, and we are organizing a live stream also for the people online who cannot make it in Eindhoven at Dutch Design Week physically, so we can all join in. Yeah, Wool Talks is an initiative that is new to this year's program. Last year we spoke about seaweed. We had one conversation and we thought maybe it's good to add more conversations throughout the week to get a good understanding of what is at display here. Like you can see all these woolen curtains, you can see the looks in the front, you can see the workshops taking place in the back of the space. We feel like we should shine light on different perspectives to understand what it takes to change an industry. Usually every morning we have a central question that we answer through the Wool Talks. And for today, the topic of the talk will be networks and system change. Because if we want to move to a more sustainable industry and we want to have systems that work better for both people, planet, but also animals, we have to talk about system change because it's an important component of getting there. Every talk we try to organize around a central question, because if we can answer it with the panel of experts, then we take steps in getting the total picture of what wool means. And for today, the question is, what is systems change? And how can collaborative networks drive the transition to a regenerative textile economy? And how can systems storytelling help us to create a collective narrative for change? There might be a lot of complex components, and with that being said, I think it's time to introduce you properly. Nanette Hogervorst from Modint. You've been involved in the textiles and fashion sector for a while. In a few sentences, what is your role at Modint right now?
Modint is the Dutch Trade Association for textiles in the Netherlands, and my role is
Innovation Manager, and initiative that brings together the industry in a certain way.
Yeah, one of the pillars of innovation is to get members together, but also get the industry together and look ahead. Despite rules and regulations, what should we do to make our sector future-proof? So we are really going beyond rules and regulations. And future-proof also for us means that it's better for planet, people and animals. Yes.
Sounds interesting. We'll talk about it more. Elise, could you briefly introduce yourself to the audience also?
Yeah, so I'm Elise. I work as an associate professor at the University of Applied Science in Amsterdam and also as a visual artist. I use stories to try to change how people think, feel and connect, especially story making. What happens when we create stories? How does that change the way we connect to each other and to the natural world?
We are dependent on the stories that we create, we write, we tell ourselves. I'm curious to learn how that relates to system change. But maybe for the audience also to understand the context in which we're having this conversation. And Nanette, before you joined Modint, you had another initiative that was about understanding and mapping out the Dutch ecosystem when it comes to sustainable fashion and textiles. Can you tell a bit about that journey?
It was something that I just started because I was intrinsically motivated. I worked in finance, but was always very interested in textiles. So I started a magazine around entrepreneurship, innovation, sustainability, and interviewed a lot of key players in the industry. So also once wrote articles about New Order Fashion, but also with designers, researchers in the field of innovation and textiles. And built on that, I started a platform as a collective, and we had like a sustainable fashion gift card. It still exists, but we also did all types of projects with all the brands that were affiliated to the gift card. So we organized a clothing library week to make people more aware how to manage your wardrobes, but we also did partnerships with Fashion Week, did pop-up shops just to really tell the story about our wardrobes and how we maybe could use our wardrobes differently.
Yeah. And you were already working with those pioneers when you had SF Collective. What kind of pioneers did you discover through that journey, like the different initiatives that you ran into?
Oh yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of people I met that once worked in the regular linear fashion industry and saw what was happening and thought, okay, I don't want to contribute to that. Started their own brand. When we relate to wool, Reina from the Knitwit stable, also a really good example, had her own fashion company and now has an own farm with sheep and creates almost locally wool sweaters and other garments. But also people are more into repair, from visible repair, really make it into an artwork instead of just fixing something invisible. Clothing libraries promote a different use of our wardrobes. Examples are endlessly.
All sorts of different pioneers that try to bring change to the sector here in the Netherlands. And did you also talk to manufacturers or raw material suppliers?
A little bit less, because I was usually working with the people who were in contact with the consumer, but they all did it themselves. I worked as PR and GUM's freelancer, for instance, Waste to Wear. It's a Chinese-Dutch company that produces garments from recycled PET bottles. Well, there's a whole discussion, of course, about recycled PET bottles, but it was a few years ago. And for me, coming from the financial industry, it was really interesting to really work for a producer company, also visiting China once. Yeah.
Seeing the factory floor, more or less,
Yes.
over there. Yeah. Elise, you have had a whole different journey in where you are today. Could you elaborate on that for the audience?
Sure. So I always liked science and art. I studied physics, renewable energy physics. So I was already Save the Planet, but really like strongly from the technology side. Then I went to work at Philips Research on sustainable lighting. It was very good because you see supply chains, you see what's behind the development of a product. But at one point I missed the human aspects of creativity. So I moved to Philips Design. And I really liked it because you can combine technological insights, human-centered design, and sustainability. That's where I also went into storytelling. We were trying to put at the same table everybody, so the producer, the business people, the users, the designers, etc. And at the time also the healthcare professional, because we're doing healthcare products, and people don't speak the same language. So it's a basic problem when you try to innovate. And that's where we started to use participatory story making as a tool to have people talk to each other. And it really works. So it can be a story around a user, around a sheep, it doesn't matter. But when people step in the shoes of this character and elaborate on their story together, something magical happens. And they start to all chip in with their own expertise and they start to understand how they think. So that's my journey.
It's an example of how storytelling and reflecting on stories works surprisingly well in different contexts, I also assume. We're going to test it out a bit later today as part of this talk. For the people coming in, we have a third microphone available for questions, so don't feel any pressure not to join the conversation. Maybe to understand what system change is. Of course, fashion and textiles is something that's close to what we do at New Order of Fashion. You also have a lot of experience with Nanette. How can we explain what system change is for the audience when we look at the fashion and textile sector?
For me, when I started with this topic, sustainability in terms of green and environment was an important topic. But I think one of my takes on it at first was, okay, I want a better industry that is greener, but not just greener. I really want it also culturally differently, but it's also about treating the workers. I think system change is not just about being green. It combines three things. So first is about technology. We need technology change so that we can indeed have these greener, clean technologies. Make sure that recycling is possible, for instance. But on the other hand, we don't only want to recycle, we also want to think differently. So cultural change, and I think cultural change really relates to storytelling. We need to think differently on how we treat our wardrobes, how we treat workers, how we treat animals. And the third one for me is also political, economical change. Also about rules and regulations. If we have a market that's linear, circular companies will never flourish because it doesn't align with each other. I think you need all these three to really make a whole system change. So we have to really phase out at the end a linear system, maybe take something of the good. We don't have to leave everything behind, but really have to phase out and really have an idea, and that storytelling can there contribute to that.
So if I understand that correctly, system change is this transition that is multifaceted. There's technology involved, there's culture involved, there's economical and political trends and changes involved, policy involved, and that all needs to work together almost as a dance towards a new system.
I think we have to be aware with that we don't have our current economy and then just have circular business models on top of that, or regenerative business models on top of that.
And for those who were not able to be here on Saturday when we kicked off our program, we spoke about regeneration, the concept of regeneration. And I think this also ties into the linear system towards a new system that might be regenerative. I think there's also a philosophical element to how we relate to the world, right? We humans tend to to feel superior compared to a mosquito in our bedroom when we can't sleep at night, for example. But to see it as equals changes the whole equation, also how we approach the use of resources and how we look at our own footprint on the world.
Often I see that we keep talking about technology. It's just as important to talk about the cultural change we have to make.
I'm happy that you mentioned that, because culture is something we all can change something about, I think, and also the narrative and the storytelling that comes in will hopefully help us to get there. The industry itself, it's a complex, multifaceted transition, multiple areas that need to align, work together. If we look at the linear value chain compared to a circular value chain, what kind of actors do we see there? And how do they need to change their ways? And to give some examples, maybe.
What's really, I think, important, it's to some extent, it starts at the beginning. When you start designing, you already have to think about how will this textile article or a garment, what will happen with it when someone has done wearing it? Where does it go? Can it go back into the ground? Can it be recycled? So it starts at the beginning with new designs, but really, really practical. If we really want to reuse our clothing more, if we really want that at a system level, it needs to scale. And right now, the whole sorting technology to be able to reuse garments on large scale is far from perfect yet. And also sorting, for instance, for recycling, if we want that. And now we're talking a lot about polyester recycling, but also if we have perfect textiles that are all regenerative and good for the environment, at the end you maybe also want to either put it back in the ground or you want to recycle it. And recycling technology is also still not there. We can also not do that on big scale. So there's a lot of technology issues we have to solve. However, to be able to make sure that there's an uptake of technology, there needs to be demand. And there's no cultural change, then the demand will also be limited. But demand can be pushed and driven by making sure that the market is ready for it. If recycled textiles are far more expensive than virgin ones, then of course the demand will also be less. It all ties together.
Yeah, there's so many interesting things that you're touching on. It's about design, making sure that what you design can actually be reused, be repaired and returned into the biosphere after the end of life. There's a challenge of scale. If new technologies, materials want to be taken up by the current processes and replace maybe more wasteful processes, there need to be skill in the solutions that we have. You talked about recycling, of course, which is the recycled product. If that's more expensive than a virgin fossil fuel-based material, then that equation also doesn't work that well. Yeah. I do want to challenge you on the topic of scale, though, because if we look at regeneration, it's also about asking ourselves the question, should we stop taking more than the earth can provide? Should we maybe put some nuances to the topic of scale in the industry? How do you look at that, maybe from your perspective at Modint?
I think that's also why we have to look differently to the sectors. You will probably need scale if we really want the whole sector to change. On the other hand, I think a local initiative, smaller initiative that are maybe linked through collaborative networks together, they could coexist. I don't think it's one way or the other. I think they can coexist with each other. But for Modint, of course, as a Dutch trade association, and to put our attention and our time, there's a bit more focus on the initiatives that lead to scale. But that said, that we don't value the maybe smaller initiative. But for me, they can coexist. From the Dutch Trade Association, it makes more sense to come up with a solution for our members and make sure they are joining this. We also have to be aware that there are companies that have a certain scale, so we also have to come up with a solution that sort of aligns with that, unless the whole world changes.
Yeah.
And that everything can be really small. So it's always this dynamic between how the world works and where the world goes to. Because, yeah, I would love to live in a world where, where there's maybe a basic income and we don't have this race to the bottom, etc. Yeah. But if the world isn't like that, we have to make sure that our companies can still be future-proof.
It makes total sense from the perspective of Modint, indeed, that you have this responsibility for all your members to take them into this transition and try to make it work on both ends. And I'm happy that you said that it can coexist, because that means as consumers, as citizens, we can participate in these regenerative alternatives that might today be small, but at some point can grow also, that the bigger industry players are looking at those initiatives and changing their ways because it's been proven that it works in today's society. Elise, you've been listening to the story about textiles and fashion for a bit. Can you see parallels in renewable energy where you originally started your journey? Do you see the same variables at play, or do you see differences?
Maybe I can share from the healthcare industry where I was. It's very difficult to disrupt the system because there are some economical incentives that are just there, and you cannot implement certain long-term sustainable solutions because of it. We've been working on system thinking, and there was a willingness to change the system. The way we found was indeed to act local, to identify the burning platforms. Basically, you first start with a bird-eye view. You try to understand how would we ideally want to disrupt the system, including cultural shifts, social shifts, etc. And then, okay, where are the burning platforms where this shift could be implemented locally? It can work or it can fail. But if it works, then you can think on how to scale it. And that can scale it geographically or in intensity. We cannot change the whole world at once, even though we really want to.
And what are some of those examples how it could work locally?
So, for instance, we've been working on how to bring healthcare in Africa. In this case, we're thinking about pregnancy care. There are certain cultural ways of guiding pregnancy that are completely not fitting the current solution. For instance, ultrasound, etc. We had to work with the ecosystem of partners locally, understand who was active in the community to guide pregnancy in villages, then design solutions that were locally relevant. Those solutions were actually paper-based. So the first step was some information, and in case the ladies who were guiding the pregnancy in the village would identify certain risk, they could advise the pregnant ladies to go to the healthcare center that was quite far away and quite difficult to reach. So this was the type of solutions we were having in mind, not anymore bringing ultrasound and devices and this type of high-tech stuff.
But taking the user as the central actor and understanding all these factors that influence. Maybe can we make, let's try. Can we make a parallel to fashion consumption? If we look at information and being part of choosing more responsibly or participating in circular ecosystems, is that something we can come up with? Or is it something we might have to discuss after the talk?
I think there are a few projects in the Netherlands. You have a project that is going to kick off Sorted, and we have the project Textile that's about recycling. I'm not sure whether they've been doing like a bird-eye view and then zoomed in, but I think they did look at what's needed and then try to bring all the key actors together in the Netherlands that were already doing something on that area. For instance, Textile is actually a project coming from Circular Plastic Canal. Also, part of Circular Plastic Canal is our polyester project. And then they also start, okay, what are the companies that are already doing something with that? And can we create a value chain, like a supply chain, that where you can actually do the whole recycling process from when it comes in, needs to be recycled, and then goes to the spinner, etc. So that could be a little bit different than ending up with a beautiful example.
Do you want to add on that, Elise?
I want to ask you something to Nanette, more about the cultural shift, because earlier you mentioned about bringing more acceptance for repaired clothes, for instance, that maybe repair is beautiful or a sign of aging in your clothes is beautiful. I just was wondering, is that something you could try to implement more locally and see if you can have a snowball effect around this type of mindset shifts?
Yeah. Definitely. I think the repairing projects, at this moment they're quite small, but I think personally they're very valuable. Yeah, it could definitely be. And I think there are I think the last few years there has been so much focused on recycling that we should broaden as a sector, broaden our view on other possibilities. Things like repair could definitely be one of them.
Repair is maybe also more about this cultural standard, whether we are used to repairing our own garments. Someone earlier this morning said we are not born as humans that we're able to ride bikes. We're being taught how to ride bikes, and then we participate in traffic. We're not born with all the skills and knowledge to repair, but maybe we can be taught how to repair, and then it becomes super normal to repair our garments like it is to ride our bikes here in the Netherlands.
Years ago, of course, everyone could do that. We've lost it with the rise of fast fashion. It wasn't even worth it to repair something because you could just buy something new. I grew up with a mom that made costumes. I grew up in a home with a needle and threads and repairing and upcycling. But I remember that I once met a friend, and every year she would clean up her closet and she had this pile of garments that she would throw away or bring to charity. And I was like, what's wrong with it? Yeah, the button was loose. So I was like, you could repair it. You don't even have to repair it. You have to. But she didn't grow up in a house where there was a needle and a thread. She had no idea.
Especially if you grow up in a generation where there's just abundance of consumer goods and you can just buy something new because it's not expensive. That doesn't help to reconsider your own behavior in that sense. I want to move a bit towards network structures in system change. From the first part of the conversation, what we've learned is that it's just interplay between technology, policy, economic factors, and also cultural factors. But is it a linear process? Is it a roadmap, or is it more of a network that needs to develop all together? Why is it important to understand this network metaphor?
I can give it a shot. What I've seen is that there's a lot of willingness to change, but for a lot of people it's very difficult to do this mindset shift from linear thinking to systemic thinking. We're really trained to think, okay, I have a problem, I'm going to think of a solution. Even how design is taught classically, I have a solution and it's fixed. If you think about a system, you need to think about how all the elements in the system interact. So it's more cause and effect rather than problem solution. It's less dualistic and more interconnected. You don't think in terms of one solution. You think, okay, in this whole system of interconnected stuff, people, events, things, I will try to turn a knob, and that's why you call a leverage point in system thinking. By turning this knob, it will shift the whole system in a certain direction. But you cannot totally control how it's going to shift. We have this deterministic thinking that we think we can plan. Like businesses, they do roadmaps, they do strategy, they have visions, but it is too deterministic. So can we shift to this non-deterministic way of things where, okay, let's iterate, let's have an intervention in the system, evaluate how the system shifts. And if you do regenerative agriculture, that's how you think as well. You cannot plan what's going to happen in 5 years. And there again, I'm coming back to my thing, but I think storytelling and systemic storytelling can help a lot. Yeah, and the other thing maybe is taking more time to understand others' perspectives. So in a complex system, you have a lot of actors, human and non-human, who have all kind of different perspectives. And really taking the time to understand why this person doesn't agree or doesn't care about what I'm doing, because it's not relevant to them. And that's okay. We don't need to care about the same thing, and we don't need to agree. But taking the time to understand their narrative, their bias, and their priorities.
I think that's something we all can learn from, regardless of which industry, but also in our personal lives, to understand the other perspective, to move towards a better future, I would say. Nanette, do you also recognize these leverage points in the textile sector and the fashion industry? And what are some examples of that?
I think one example, I think what's now happening is, of course, the action plan Circular Textiles, which is an initiative from the government, but in collaboration with the sector, is how to translate the circular ambitions plan of the government into a more action-focused plan. I think one of the things that team is actually doing pretty well is that they start with a coalition of the willing. And when I still worked at corporate finance world, one of the things that I learned from the sustainability manager was there, start with the coalition of the willing, because then at least you get started, and at least you have some support around you, and then when you have to go beyond the coalition of the willing. I think the action plan Circular Textiles is a good example, because we really try with a group of people in the Netherlands to get more people behind that plan that also focuses on a more circular and sustainable sector. But I think the challenge now is, okay, I think there's a good foundation of people who really want to lead this change, but now how do we can get the others on board? That's usually the most challenging part of system change.
For you, where does the change start? If you think about this platform, where should we start? With the willing, of course, but where do you start?
I think change doesn't necessarily have to you have to start there. If one thing starts, I think adding to what you said, it's also about timing. I think that's really relevant for change, because you can understand the other, but when you want change, it's about in what space and what is that person. If the timing isn't right for that person, it will be really hard to make sure that person will join you.
It's this complicated, imperfect process, and it's hard to put the finger on where the leverage points are. Maybe the coalition of the willing, the intrinsically motivated bottom-up initiative almost. That's like the first version of a network. And then once people that might have been a bit more skeptical look back at that coalition of the willing and see what they're actually to change, it's, oh, there's a version 2.0, 3.0, and that's how the network, I think, develops.
Many beautiful initiatives, so it's really...
But I think it's organically, but you can anticipate. One of the projects that we now currently doing at Modint is think about 4 scenarios for the future for the sector. And it's also about storytelling, because the scenarios are actually stories how the future could look like for our sector. And we don't know where the world will go to, but based on the current trends, it might be that way, or it might go the other way. And of course, in practice, it It won't be completely right. It will probably be a more nuanced version of the future, but you can anticipate on that future.
And also what I think is an interesting thought is that this network develops and you have these different points where you have influence. Policy is of course also a major one, like it sets the rules of the game that the industry has to play by. There's a lot more nuance to it. Sometimes the rules are being cheated on. Those examples are there, fortunately, but those are some pressure points. I want to move a bit more into the exercise of thinking about ourselves in the audience. Do I play a role in that network? We are of course talking about wool this week. We spoke with shepherds yesterday. We spoke with system thinkers on Saturday. We spoke with the historians on Sunday. If I look at wool as a material, I can now say, okay, shepherds play a key role, washing facilities play an important role, spinners play a role, designers play a role, consumers play a role. And Elise, maybe also this is a good introduction for what we want to talk about next, and this storytelling narrative. What can be a possible narrative we can learn from, and we can also look for our own role in that narrative for? I'll put on your slides also.
Okay, one of my current battles, and maybe it's relevant for this discussion, and I'm actually curious to hear your thought about that, is how brainwashed we are with this hero's journey. There is this narrative framework that's used in 99% of the Netflix stuff we watch and all the bestseller we read, and it's basically this idea that there is a hero who has a call to action and goes for an adventure. He discovers himself along the way, and there's all kind of struggles and fights, and there's even a final fight and a climax. They come back, and maybe there's one last fight, and they have changed themselves, but often they've also a bit saved the world, at least their world. And if you start to really look at that, you already recognize that in a lot of places, at least in our Western societies, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to have this type of exceptionalist journeys. And like millennials, Gen Z, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a pressure to have it all, do it all, be a good professionally, socially with your partner. They tell you, follow your dreams, show off who you are, I think there's something quite problematic there. I don't say that's the only reason, but I think this is a quite obvious symptom of it. There's all those masculine values in those narratives like bravery and strength, and also those dualist values. Very often the hero is good and we're fighting the evil. When you talk about sustainability, is that the narrative we want to have? If you save the planet, you're good. If you pollute, you're bad. I'm not sure that's very constructive. And it's very individualist. And then I'm basically saying that there's all kind of alternative frameworks, and I don't say those are all the frameworks, but those are good examples that reflect this cultural shift we were discussing. So those values of systemic thinking, so imperfect and resilient and collective. So for instance, if you look at Lord of the Rings, of course you have certain of hero's journey, but it is more about the collective action and the collective agency than individual heroes. And maybe that's also something we could think of. For instance, in the previous question, you were asking, where does the change start? I think there's a lot to be gained in amplifying what is already there, the local actions that have positive effect, and collectively trying to amplify them instead of reinventing the wheel, so your name is tagged next to that. There is all kind of feminist stories you can think of where we just observe and take a step back and feel instead of acting and doing. Slice of life, very small stories, like daily stories. Instead of having a big goal, let's see what I can do today to change how I'm going to produce this little piece of textile. More than human, that's super relevant. Can we take the perspective also of animals, vegetables, natural ecosystems? Anti-heroes, that's basically accepting that we're flawed, that we're going to fail, that we're imperfect, and that's okay. Maybe we're okay as we are, and we can work with who we are. And finally, absurdist, and that's one I really like, or wanderer, like Alice in Wonderland. I don't know for you, but for me, the world doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's okay. You can just wander around and try to deal with what comes your way. So those are other ways to create narratives for yourself in your personal life, professional life, or as a group, as an organization. I work a lot with those narratives. I don't know how it resonates with you in that context.
I think there might be a time and place for every of these narratives, and maybe like this hero journey narrative made a lot of sense back in the 80s and 90s. The world was different back then. We didn't have social media. We didn't have these crises coming at us in rapid pace. So maybe there was a place for the narrative, but I can see how we need new narratives to navigate today's world. Is that something you you would agree that like the world became more complex in that sense that these narratives do not cover for that complexity?
Yeah, even if you go back to economic models, in the 80s, this hero's journey became super popular with Star Wars. And at the time, we were really about a growth economy, yeah? And this is a growth narrative. The hero grows. It's a linear story where you become better.
Yeah.
And that's not the thinking we need anymore.
Yeah. And the regenerative or more circular story is maybe this story of life and death and that there's a new generation coming after one another. No, and also these narratives, I can imagine you can apply them at different levels, right? At the level of the individual, it might make sense to look at your own life and see, I can find my situation with my career or a personal life in a certain corner of these narratives, but also as an organization, of course, it can also make sense. Have you spoken to different organizations where you could tell that some of these narratives were very relevant, or did it take time for them to recognize themselves in those narratives?
At least in terms of branding, because some organizations have a very hero's journey branding, like Nike, you're the hero, you're going to perform. But I was working with IKEA a few weeks ago, and if you look at their branding, they do a lot of slice of life collective branding. Like it's a lot about family, coziness, doing stuff together, building your couch and you're happy. I think some organizations are aware of it, but internally I'm not sure.
If we look at the different narratives, is there any narrative that you think is particularly relevant for ecosystem thinking, the network and system change in textiles? Or is it a combination depending on what actor in that network you are?
I think they're all super relevant, but when I try to apply that in workshops, I always start with the anti-hero. I call it the unapologetic hero, and it's basically accepting that you are who you are unapologetically, including your flaws. So don't try to transform yourself too much, because the world is transforming. So if you need to transform yourself plus transform the world at the same time, I think it's a lot. Maybe do with what you have, and then deal with the world with the absurdist, wandering way, and collective way also.
And absurdism not as a way of escaping reality, but to bring balance in everyday life.
Maybe more accepting reality than escaping it.
Good. And maybe for the audience, I see a question all the way at the top.
Hi, I just wanted to know, is there a way out of the financial, for example, Nike is listed on the stock exchange, so they have a responsibility towards the stakeholders to produce and have higher revenues year by year. Is there a way out of keeping this finance stock out of fashion?
If I might share some of my thoughts on that, it's pressure points in a network. I think shareholders that have bought company stock with the sole intention to increase their capital is a pressure point that's counterproductive for stepping away from just financial values. But then at the same time, you might see impact funds driven by different values that buy company stock with more the intent or the purpose to make sure the vision stays alive, despite the fact that the world might change, right? If there's a company that truly has a vision to change the world, to do something differently that is about fundamental changes and sustainability, then yeah, I think it takes brave founders, founding teams, and shareholders to protect that purpose. And there are some developments that is a bit technical, but there's something called steward ownership, where as a brand and a company owner, you can split ownership and governance of a company. Ownership still relates to the financial value, but governance says something about the decisions that you make as a company. If you make a construction where you would have a foundation that would become owner of the governance, then the foundation doesn't have this financial incentive and can protect the purpose of the company moving into the future. That does make you less appealing to other investors, because the mainstream capital market is still mostly about making exponential revenue or increasing their capital. So it's not the easiest way, but it is a way to apply this long-term thinking within the organization. Once you sold your soul, I don't know if there's a way to go back.
Maybe quickly, from what I've seen, if you are owned by shareholders, even with the best intention, it is difficult. It is very difficult. I think if you're privately owned, let's say Patagonia to name one, but also maybe IKEA, you have a bit more bandwidth to take radical decisions.
And also if you're a family-owned business and you have values running in the family, that's also a way. Do you have something to add on that, Nanette?
Indeed, it is also about how you structure the company. And then what type of investors do you attract? For instance, like Unilever once was on the stock market exchange because they were just a really big company, and then Paul Polman came in, wanted to do another course, go in another direction. Yeah, that's difficult because the main shareholder bubble is was there for creating more financial value. But if you start in a complete different way, then there's definitely a chance. And on the other hand, to advocate a little for being on the stock market, being on the stock market means you need to be very transparent. For instance, H&M and Zara, I won't make a plea here that they're good, but at least they have to be transparent because they're on the stock market. There's a lot of small brands we have no idea. And they don't have any obligations to report because they're not listed. Being listed doesn't always have to be negative.
It comes with obligations to be transparent, where privately owned companies might not have to disclose
And then
their supply chain operations.
You don't know anything about them.
Yeah, so it's a good nuance. Thank you for adding that. What I do want to try to do is bring it back to the initial question, right? Understanding system change and what it was. I think what we've learned in our panel of discussion today is that it is this complex interplay of different variables: technology, policy, economics, and also culture. To understand the network in fashion, all these different actors that need to work together, and network dynamics are more like as it evolves from level 0 to 1, 2. That's how change happens in the system.
If it's about textiles, especially when we talk about fashion, it's a very consumer-facing sector. We all know the brands, but a lot of Dutch brands are quite small. And even if you go to Europe, more than 95% is actually micro or small companies. And also in the Netherlands, more than 95% are small companies. I think that makes it sometimes difficult to change because it's so dispersed. And they don't have big R&D budgets. I think governments, but also actors like Modint, that there are platforms that working together can therefore be very valuable in a change for textiles. Originally, I come from the financial sector. These are really big companies that have a lot of budget, that have a lot of manpower to ignite change. That's there are exceptions, of course, but in general, for textile companies or fashion companies, they're just smaller, so it's more difficult for them.
Yeah. So there's an even bigger reason to collaborate and to act in this bigger network, and by the help of Modint, of course, make change together as a small network players all together. Yeah. And to wrap things up, maybe Elise, with how can system storytelling help us as fashion and textiles enthusiasts? What should we take away from your contribution today?
I'm not sure about the takeaway, but there's one word I haven't heard, we haven't talked about: minimalism or deconsumerism. I feel there's a lot to be done there because we always come from the company's perspective, but from consumer perspective, there's a lot to be done on how we consume. I'm just thinking about it because my lucky socks have a hole, and for the first time, I think I'm going to repair my socks. There's an emotional attachment to those socks for some reasons. So can we change how we consume there?
The story we tell ourselves is more about appreciation, care, slowing down, being happy and content with less.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
If you can share with us a website or a resource where we can actually see that brand is sustainable, because you said that most brands are small businesses in Europe. So if you want to share any sources.
There are a few, like Good on You, that lists all types of brands, also in cosmetics, textiles, fashion. And you have Kosh Eco, that also lists all sorts of brands that are really dedicated for making the sector more sustainable.
Right, thank you. That brings us to the end of this afternoon's talk. So that leaves me to thank our partners. First of all, can I have applause for my panelists, Nanette and Elise? Thank you so much for your contributions. Special thanks to AV Partner for organizing this year's live stream, because this way we're also able to exchange knowledge through the internet and online. Thank you. Quick applause. And of course, a big applause to yourself for being here and being curious. Thank you for the questions, and have a great rest of your day in Dutch Design Week. Thank you.